Today, I'll let you in on a secret. Those big, profitable river bluffs are within your reach, because bluffing the river is so much easier than most people think. In fact, I believe that the main reason why many people struggle with river bluffing is not because they lack technical skills, but because they lack a good river bluffing method. I will teach you this method, and in addition, I will also teach you the two fundamental principles that explain why bluffing well in the river is so essential to your win rate. But let me start with an analogy. You're driving in the desert and your car gets a flat tire. No problem, you know exactly what to do. You put on your parking brake, you know where the jack goes, and how to switch that tire out for the spare. You're a master. It's a simple operation, but imagine just how bad it would be if you got that flat tire in the desert and you didn't know this procedure. I would bet you didn't use trial and error to figure this skill out. Someone taught you the method. In this flat tire situation, the solution is easy because all you have to do is execute that straightforward procedure from memory. But when it comes to putting your entire stack on the line in poker, all of a sudden it's hard. So much is happening. MDF, table image, ranges, HUD stats, leveling. You need a method to cut the BS. There's too much to lose. And of course, every good method begins with a good understanding of what you're trying to do. When it comes to river bluffing, that understanding boils down to two fundamental principles. As we'll see throughout this video, it almost feels like the game of poker was built around exploiting people on the river. There's three main reasons why. First, the river is rare. We don't get to the river very often against any opponent, which means that it usually takes our opponent hundreds of thousands of hands to realize how we're exploiting them. And by the time they realize, we can always just change our strategy. Secondly, our incentive to exploit people is higher on the river because pots are usually quite big. Have a look at the Chai aggression matrix, posted in my Discord. This grid clearly shows that we should maximally exploit rare and profitable spots. The river meets both of these criteria. And lastly, there's a big skill asymmetry on the river. Our opponents have a notoriously difficult time defending well in the street, but as we'll see shortly, we usually have a very easy time attacking. Our opponents struggle to defend mostly because river spots are very diverse. There's so much variation on the river, so it's almost impossible to learn how to defend on each one. Heuristics are varied, complex, and often have to do with blockers and many in different hands. It's tough, and I don't blame them one bit for not getting it perfect. But when they get it even slightly wrong, our own strategy becomes so incredibly profitable and simple. And this is due to the second principle of river bluffing. Consider this example. We're playing as big blind versus button as the preflop 3-better, holding jack 7 of clubs. Flop comes 10-10-5 rainbow, we bet half pot and get called. Turn is a king giving us a flush draw. We bet again and we get called. River is a 9. Now we have a missed draw and have to decide if we want to bluff or not. Let's see what our river bluffing range looks like in Solver. This right here is our total range, and these are our bluffs. We're bluffing 34% of the time. In this example, jack 7 of clubs loses EV as a jam. But now, let's head over to our opponent's response. If they're playing perfect Nash up to this point, you can see that they should call around 34 of their 53 combos facing a jam. Now, we'll remove just one combo from their range. Just one. We'll make them call 33 instead of 34 combos. And if we remove just one combo, we can start bluffing anything. Our bluffing frequency used to be around 34%, but now it goes up to 84%. And our bluffs don't just gain a sliver of EV that makes them slightly profitable to bluff. Jack 7 is now worth more than 3 big blinds as a bluff. That is a huge amount. And all of that EV gain is due to the tiniest overfold. Many times, the EV gain is much, much bigger. Of course, the contrary is true as well. In this example, if our opponent overcalls one combo, then our bluffs lose 3 big blinds in EV, and our ideal bluffing frequency decreases. It's now a huge mistake to bluff jack 7 of clubs. However, as you can see, there are still many pure bluffs in our range. This is because they have good blockers and are still mandatory bluffs. Blockers are very important, and I'll talk a bit more about them at the end of this video. But the vast majority of our bluffing range is incredibly sensitive to villain's folding frequency. Because our bluffing strategy swings so much, there is no such thing as a small mistake on the river. And this principle is exclusive to the river. On the turn, for example, our bluffing strategy doesn't swing quite as much. And this is a big point which highly impacts the way we play the river. So it's important to understand it mathematically, which we can quickly do by comparing the EV breakdown of our bluffs on the river to their breakdown on the turn. Let's start this comparison by just seeing how our bluffs gain EV on the river. So this is the EV equation. Our bluffs win the pot when our opponent folds, and they lose their bet size when our opponent calls. So the entire EV of our bluffs really revolves around our opponent's folding frequency. On the turn, however, the EV equation is different. Our bluffs still win when our opponent folds, but when our opponent calls, we don't lose our entire investment. This is because our hand has some equity and it has the potential to win. Usually our hand will still lose, but on average we do win some chips back. And so because the EV difference between getting villain to fold and getting called isn't quite as big on the turn, our hand is a little bit less sensitive to villain's folding frequency. But on the river, getting a fold is the only way we can win. Our hands have no equity, and so our opponent's folding frequency is the main thing that matters. It almost entirely boils down to this point. Now recall from the previous principle that rivers are rare high EV spots that are very difficult for our opponents to play. Our opponents will almost always overfold or underfold, and the risk of counter exploitation is fairly low. This allows us to play a very binary bluffing strategy. If we ignore blockers, then very simply, if villain overfolds a tiny bit, we should bluff everything. If villain overcalls a tiny bit, we should never bluff. And again, we'll talk blockers later. But even so, this understanding only gets us so far. If we knew where every overfold and overcall was, we would, in my friend Brendan's words, be taking constant trips to the $500 store. We would be poker gods swimming in chips. But in reality, we have to settle for just an edge. And to maximize that edge and crush our opponents, we need a river bluffing plan that is effective and easy to execute in-game. My friends, мои друзья, mis amigos, let me take a quick moment to tell you guys to join my Discord linked below. I'm building a motivated community and I really want you guys to be a part of it. I'm doing daily hand reviews, so if you're in a downswing, join the Discord and I will help you fix your play right up. Back to the video. So the basic method for river bluffing is a 3-step plan which helps you find those profitable spots to bluff in-game. Simply, it helps you estimate if your opponent will reasonably overfold or underfold on any river. And remember, when your opponent overfolds, you can usually just bluff anything without showdown value. To best estimate what your opponent will do, we need to consider 3 things step by step. We need to consider the board texture, the villain profile, and our own table image. These 3 things seem simple because I made the method that way on purpose. But there's important nuance here, so I need to discuss each step in depth. First, let's talk about board texture. Consider the 2 following boards. We're playing big blind versus button, again as the preflop 3-better. We bet half pot on the flop, get called, bet half pot again on the turn, and get called. We can bluff again for half pot on the river. On which board would you prefer to bluff? On the board on the left, or on the low board on the right? The first board looks very scary. A flush completes, there's an ace on the river, it seems tough to get folds. The low board, however, looks a lot more promising. We can easily estimate that our opponent's calling threshold is some, but not all of their ace highs. But I actually wouldn't bluff here, and the reason has to do with their turn calling range. This is our opponent's Nash strategy facing a bet on the turn. Now they're not playing Nash, so to me, there are 2 main possible scenarios. Scenario A is that our opponent overfolds their ace highs on the turn. If this is true, then they don't have the ace highs to overfold on the river. All that's left is a bunch of pairs, which most good regs are going to call versus a river jam at this SPR. Scenario B is that our opponent overcalls their ace highs on the turn. And if they're overcalling on the turn, there's a reasonably large chance it's because they think that we're bluffing too much. And if they think that we're bluffing too much, then they'll probably also overcall on the river. I wouldn't bluff on the low board for this reason. But upon closer examination, the other wet board is actually a nice spot to bluff. Wet boards are scary for both players. Just like we're putting our opponent on many strong hands, our opponent is also putting us on many strong hands. We have lots of flushes and other strong hands here, and our opponent might think that it's hard for us to find enough bluffs. However, if we look at the solution, you'll actually see that villain's calling threshold here is quite low. They should be calling many second pairs, and even under pairs without the flush blocker. It's hard to find these. This board is much better to bluff on. Now this example highlights the importance of texture when bluffing. Some textures are much better for bluffing than others, both because the calling thresholds differ and because our opponent is much more likely to put us on a stronger range. Finding good textures to bluff on is hard, and it takes a lot of work. But poker isn't meant to be easy, and the best players will have a strong willingness to learn. If this video gets a lot of interest, I'll make sure to make a follow-up that breaks down some of the best river textures to bluff. If you're interested, give the video a like, give it a comment, it boosts engagement and I want to make a video that people will watch. But in case I don't make it, let me give you the summary. Good textures have a low calling threshold that is easy to miss, a low possibility of our opponent over-folding on previous streets, and a natural preference for us to bet big. When we're deciding whether or not to bluff the river, these are the first things that we should think about. If the texture is bad, don't bluff. And if it's good, move on to step 2. When considering villain profile, we're mainly trying to figure out if our opponent likes to bluff catch or not. It is my belief that there are 2 main types of people in most poker pools: people who like to bluff catch and people who don't. Most people fall into the don't catch category. This player type is usually a bit timid and risk averse throughout the entire game tree, which extends to the river. I think most poker players already know how to identify this player type, but I do want to mention a few misleading indicators that do not tell you if a player is timid. The first one is if they c-bet a lot on the flop. A lot of players range bet and have standardized flop strategies. Aggression on the flop tells you nothing about a player's type, but continued aggression on the turn and river does. 2 is if they stab a lot on the turn. Stabbing a lot on the turn is a big exploit, but it's a very low investment. It's a single, usually small bluff. Timid players will be okay making small bluffs, but it's their lack of big ones that tells us who they are. And 3, another misleading indicator is if they bluff a lot in broken lines. So for example, bet check bet or check check bet. Any line with a check in it. A lot of players will bluff after the table checks, and again, this is a low investment bluff. If someone is bluffing in a broken line, they're usually trying to push you off a weak hand. It doesn't necessarily show a lot of aggression to do this. Aggressive players will definitely bluff here, but many tighter players will as well. Remember, what makes a player timid is their unwillingness to commit in big, scary pots, not small, lower risk ones. If you're up against a timid player, you're much more likely to get folds in big river pots, and so you should bluff more. Versus aggressive players though, you should only bluff on really good textures. But before you make that bluff, there's one final step to consider. We can be playing on a really good texture against a timid opponent, but with the wrong table image, we sometimes might not have the fold equity that we think. I said in the previous section that rivers are great for maximally exploiting our opponents, in part because they're so rare. If we choose to be very aggressive on good rivers, we can fly under the radar for a very long time. But there are many other common spots in poker which also reward aggression. Just think about it. If we're aggressive pre-flop, on the flop, on the turn, and on the river, then even very timid opponents will have an easy time seeing right through our bluff-heavy strategy and calling more on the river. Now in my previous video, linked somewhere in the top corner, I said it was not an issue to have an overly aggressive table image, but only if you know what you're doing. As an example, if you remember the scary board from before, our opponents had to bluff catch with tons of weak pairs versus the river jam. On this board, it doesn't really matter how aggressive our table image is, our opponents are unlikely to call wide enough because they probably won't find this low threshold. We can still bluff aggressively. But other spots, like the low board, are very sensitive to our table image. Our opponent's calling threshold is much more clear, and it's very easy for villains to visualize the bluffs in our range. As a result, even timid opponents will overcall their ace highs on this board if they think we bluff too much. Table image is a much bigger factor here. If you have a very aggressive table image, you need to be far more selective with the boards that you bluff on. Being this selective is hard, but in my opinion, it's the best way to play poker, and it's something that you work towards. As you get better and better, you'll feel much more comfortable playing hyper aggressively. But until you feel ready, I simply recommend that you just do your best to keep your aggression mostly in line. Don't be too aggressive in common spots, and save those big exploits for the giant rivers. Now there's one big thing left to discuss, but first I want to just tie everything together with one final example. We're playing big blind versus button as the pre-flop 3-better, holding king 10 of hearts. Our opponent is fairly timid and we don't have a super aggressive table image. Flop comes jack 8 deuce rainbow, we bet half pot and we get called. The turn is a 3 flush draw, we bet half the pot and we get called. In the river comes the ace of spades. Should we bluff? Using the basic method, we consider 3 things step by step. First, we consider the board texture. The texture is fairly neutral. We can reasonably estimate that the calling threshold here is going to be somewhat low, maybe some weak pair. We also know that our opponent has some missed flush draws in their range, and there's not a huge risk of them overfolding weak pairs on the previous street. This texture seems okay to bluff. Most people will probably overfold a bit. Next, we consider the villain profile. We know our opponent is timid, which probably increases our fold equity, which again just makes bluffing better. And lastly, we consider our own table image. In this example, I made it very simple. We just have no reason to believe that our opponents think that we're massively over bluffing. And now that we've considered each step, we can make that bluff. And finally, before I end the video, I want to mention one very important caveat: blockers. Now, I made this bluffing guide very simple on purpose. I said that we should always bluff if our opponent overfolds, and that we should never bluff if our opponent overcalls. This is a very, very good baseline, because it describes how to play something like 80% of our bluffs. But that other 20% of the time, our bluff will have such a strong preference to bluff or check that we usually have to play it that way regardless of small deviations in our opponent's folding frequency. River blockers are very tricky to spot, but there are a few common patterns to learn. So I recommend sticking to the binary bluffing strategy and only deviating from it if you're very certain that your hand has a very clear preference to better check regardless of small mistakes villain could be making. This is much easier said than done, and just like finding good bluffing textures, it takes a ton of work. But if you're interested in adding a bit of complexity to your strategy and making a little bit more money, let me know and I'll do that work for you. Give me a comment or tell me in the Discord, link right below. If this video does well and there's interest, I will teach you everything there is to know about river blockers. But with that being said, you can see right over here, the sun is setting, so I'm going to go watch the sunset. If you guys like the video, give it a comment, give it a like, subscribe, and there should be another video right up here for you guys to check out. Join the Discord, we're doing hand reviews, we're doing hand of the day there, and I really want to build that community. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.